The first time my mother told me I wasn't welcome in the family home anymore, she didn't even look me in the eye. She was busy polishing the silver tea set that had belonged to my grandmother, the one she only brought out when guests mattered. "You'll understand one day," she said softly. "Some people are meant to carry the family name. Others are meant to step aside." I stood there holding a cardboard box with every photograph, school certificate, and birthday card I'd ever kept. Everything that proved I'd existed in that house for 34 years fit inside one worn-out box. My older brother, Julian, leaned against the doorway with the same satisfied smile he'd worn since we were children. "I'll help you carry that to your car," he offered. Not because he was kind, because he wanted to make sure I actually left. I picked up the box myself. "I've got it." "I know you do," he replied. "You always carry your own weight." At the time, I thought it was another insult. Months later, I realized it was the only honest thing he'd ever said to me. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I restore old books. Not sell them. Not collect them. Restore them. When people bring me a Bible that survived 3 generations or a diary rescued from a flooded basement, they don't come because they want a prettier cover. They come because they want their memories to survive. My hands spend every day repairing pages everyone else believes are beyond saving. Funny, isn't it? Because my own family decided I wasn't worth repairing long ago. Our family owned Whitmore Publishing, one of the oldest independent publishing houses in the state. My grandfather built it with one printing press and impossible determination. My father turned it into a respected company. Julian was always introduced as the future. I was introduced as our artistic daughter. When I was 8, my father gave Julian his first business ledger. He gave me a leather bookmark. When I was 12, Julian toured the printing floor. I learned how to stitch damaged book bindings from old. Mr. Alvarez in the basement. Workshop because nobody else wanted to spend time down there. That basement became my favorite place. It smelled of paper, leather, glue, and history. Books don't care whether you're the favorite child. They only care whether your hands are gentle. Mr. Alvarez used to tell me something while teaching me invisible stitching. "The strongest repair," he'd whisper, "is the one nobody notices." I believed him. Maybe too much. I became so good at disappearing that eventually everyone else believed I wasn't there either. When my father retired because of his failing heart, Julian naturally became chief operating officer. No one questioned it, including me. I had already opened my tiny restoration studio 45 minutes outside the city in an old train station nobody wanted. Business was slow. Enough to survive, not enough to become important. I liked it that way, or at least I convinced myself I did. Then my father died. The funeral filled the old stone church with authors, editors, printers, politicians, and people I'd never met. Everyone hugged Julian. Everyone praised his strength. I sat quietly in the 3rd row. Not the front. I'd stopped sitting in front years earlier. No one had asked me to move. I had simply learned where I belonged. After the service, people gathered outside beneath gray skies. Julian stood on the church steps, shaking hands like he'd already inherited everything. When he finally noticed me, he smiled. Not warmly, patiently, like someone dealing with an awkward mistake. "You don't need to stay for the family meeting," he said. "I am family," he sighed. "Clara." That sigh. My whole childhood lived inside that one sigh. The lawyers only need immediate management. I was Dad's daughter. "You restored books." I restored his books. You know what I mean. Around us, conversations slowed. People pretended not to listen. They always pretend. "I'll wait inside," I said. Julian stepped sideways, blocking the doorway. "I'd rather you didn't." For one second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't moving. My own brother stood between me and my father's final meeting. Behind him, I saw my mother looking everywhere except at me. She could have said one sentence. "Let her in." She didn't. Instead, she folded her hands and stared at the stained glass windows. "I don't want a scene," Julian said quietly. Neither did I. I'd spent my entire life preventing scenes. So I nodded. "I understand." I walked down the church steps carrying nothing. No inheritance. No invitation. No place. The wind had picked up by the time I reached the parking lot. I sat inside my old hatchback without starting the engine. My phone buzzed. Not from family, from a client. An elderly woman asking if her husband's war journal was ready. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I answered, "Yes. I'll finish it tonight." Because no matter what had happened at the church, someone else's memories still deserved careful hands. I drove back to my little workshop before sunset. The station was quiet, except for the ticking wall clock and the smell of fresh leather adhesive. The journal waited on my bench exactly where I'd left it. Its spine had been torn nearly in half. Most people would have replaced it. I couldn't. Old things deserve honesty, not shortcuts. As I threaded waxed linen through the original sewing holes, headlights swept across the workshop window. A black sedan stopped outside. Not expensive. Government expensive. The driver didn't get out immediately. He sat there for almost a minute, watching the workshop. Finally, an older man stepped inside wearing a charcoal overcoat despite the warm evening. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "You are," I replied. "But that's all right." He smiled. "My name is Samuel Reed. I handled your father's legal affairs." I laid the journal down. "I thought everything would have been settled with Julian." "So did everyone else." He placed a long sealed envelope on my workbench. Cream-colored. Heavy. My name written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I felt every sound in the room disappear. "When was this written?" I asked. "Almost 3 years ago." My hand suddenly didn't feel steady anymore. "Why are you bringing it now?" "Because your father left very specific instructions." Samuel looked directly at me. He said this envelope could only be delivered after someone tried to convince you that you didn't belong. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. I stared at my father's handwriting. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't thinking about what my family had taken from me. I was wondering what my father had been waiting 3 years to tell me. The envelope sat on my workbench for almost an hour before I touched it again. I kept finding excuses. Straighten the tools, finish one more stitch, boil fresh coffee. Anything except break the seal. Because once I opened it, whatever my father had left behind would become permanent. There would be no asking him what he meant. No second conversation. No chance to tell him everything I'd swallowed for 30 years. Finally, I slid a letter opener beneath the wax. Inside was a single folded page. And a brass key. Old. Heavy. Its tag read only 3 words. Archive Room B. I frowned. There was no Archive Room B in the public offices. Not anymore. It had been closed nearly 20 years earlier when the company renovated the headquarters. I unfolded the letter. "Clara, if you're reading this, then someone has mistaken quietness for weakness again. Don't be angry with them. I made that mistake first." My throat tightened. "Go to Archive Room B before you attend any meeting. Everything you need to understand is waiting there. Trust your hands before you trust anyone's words. Dad." That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just 6 sentences. Samuel watched me carefully. He never told me what was inside the room. He only said you'd know what mattered. The next morning, I drove back to Whitmore, publishing for the first time since the funeral. The receptionist looked startled. No one stopped me. No one greeted me either. Most employees smiled politely, the way people smile at someone they assume will soon disappear. The basement hallway hadn't changed in decades. Same concrete floor, same smell of paper dust, same humming pipes overhead. At the very end stood an old steel door, Archive Room B. The brass key turned with surprising ease. The room was dark. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning light. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling. Thousands of books. First editions. Manuscripts. Printing samples. Family records. Nothing looked organized. Everything looked loved. I walked farther inside until I noticed a work table. My father's magnifying lamp still stood there. So did his reading glasses. It looked as though he'd stepped out only minutes earlier. Then I saw the ledger. Leather-bound. My father's handwriting filled every page. Not financial records, observations, dates, book restorations, employee names, ideas, and tucked between 2 pages, A photograph. Me. I couldn't breathe for a second. I was 16, sitting beside Mr. Alvarez, laughing over a damaged atlas. Someone had taken the picture without my knowing. On the back, my father had written, "She sees what everyone else throws away." I turned another page. Another note. "Julian understands profit. Clara understands value." Another. "One builds a company. The other preserves its soul." I sat down slowly. My father had been writing about me for years. Things he'd never once said aloud. Then something slipped from the back cover. A folded document. Official. Stamped. Signed. I opened it. My eyes stopped on the first paragraph. Transfer of controlling voting shares. No, that couldn't be right. I kept reading. 91%. Transferred. Effective immediately upon his death. To Clara Elizabeth Whitmore. I read it 3 times. The numbers never changed. Julian hadn't inherited control. I had. The door behind me opened. I turned. Samuel stood there. "So," he asked quietly, "now you know?" I couldn't answer. "This is impossible." It surprised me too. "But your father updated the papers personally." He was very clear. I looked down again. "My brother thinks he owns the company. He owns many shares." Samuel nodded. "But not enough to outvote you." The room suddenly felt too small. All those years, all those holidays, every dinner where Julian discussed expansion while I quietly repaired torn family, Bibles in the basement, every birthday where I received art supplies while he received business books. Had my father already decided? Had he known? Samuel interrupted my thoughts. "There's one more thing." He handed me another envelope. Smaller. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping. A photograph. Not of me. Of an elderly woman smiling beside a restored 19th century family Bible. The headline read, "Local book conservator saves historic collection." It was my shop. My work? The article was 3 years old. Across the top, my father had written only 4 words. "This is real leadership." I laughed once. A broken little sound. Because my father had never once visited my shop. Never. At least, I thought he hadn't. Samuel cleared his throat. "He actually did." I looked up. "What?" "He came on a rainy Thursday. Nearly 3 years ago. He didn't tell you who he was." My heartbeat stumbled. What?" He wore an old cap. "Introduced himself as Mr. Harris. He brought in a damaged family Bible." My hands went cold. I remembered him. The difficult customer. Quiet, sharp-eyed. Insisted. I repair one loose section twice because the stitching wasn't perfectly aligned. He'd paid cash. Left no phone number. Disappeared. I'd complained about him for weeks afterward. Samuel smiled sadly. "He never stopped talking about your hands after that. He said you touched damaged books the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat." Everything inside me went completely still. My father had been sitting 3 feet away from me, watching me work, testing me, believing in me, without ever saying my name. I pressed both hands against the old work table, because suddenly I understood something that made my chest ache. He hadn't trusted compliments. He trusted craftsmanship, so the only way he knew how to measure me was by becoming my customer. Tears blurred the photograph in my hands. For years I'd believed my father had never truly seen me. Now I knew something even harder to carry. He had seen me. Perfectly. And somehow, he'd still never found the courage to tell me while he was alive. That afternoon, Samuel looked at me carefully before speaking. "The board meets tomorrow morning. They're expecting Julian to be confirmed as chairman." I folded the share certificate back into its envelope. "And what happens when they discover the truth?" Samuel gave a tired smile. "I imagine the entire Whitmore family will discover they never actually knew their quiet daughter at all." By the time the board meeting ended, the rain had begun. Rosalind stood alone in the empty hallway outside the conference room, watching gray water crawl down the tall windows. Inside the sewing chest rested the voting certificate, her father's letter, and the worn piece of charcoal herringbone cloth that had changed everything. She closed the lid gently. Not because the story was over, because a new one had finally begun. The weeks that followed were harder than victory had any right to be. Saving people was expensive. Keeping the old textile mill alive meant replacing ancient machinery one piece at a time. Orders had to be won back. Customers who had drifted away because of cheaper competitors had to be convinced that craftsmanship still mattered. Rosalind spent mornings in board meetings and afternoons sitting beside Nora, teaching apprentices how to pad a lapel by hand. The newspapers called it an unusual management style. The workers simply called it Tuesday. One afternoon, Cole found her sweeping thread off the workshop floor. "You know," he laughed, "most chairwomen hire someone else to do that." Rosalind smiled without looking up. "My father taught me something without meaning to." "What's that?" "The day the owner refuses to touch the floor, he stops understanding what keeps the roof standing." Cole laughed so hard he nearly dropped the jacket he was carrying. Business slowly changed. Customers who bought one Vance jacket came back. Not because advertisements were clever, but because the coats lasted. Fashion magazines began writing about the return of honest tailoring. Young designers visited just to watch Nora work. The waiting list grew from 6 weeks to 6 months. For the first time in decades, quality became profitable again. Everett watched all of it from operations. At first, he fought every change. He complained about costs, argued over slower production, predicted disaster. Then one afternoon, he quietly walked into Rosalind's office carrying a sales report. He laid it on her desk. "We're up 23%. She looked at him. "I know. I checked the numbers 3 times. "I know." He hesitated. "I thought customers wouldn't notice." Rosalind smiled. "They didn't notice. They felt it." He stood there for another moment. "I still don't understand how you knew," she answered softly. "Because people don't always know why they trust something. They just know when someone cared while making it." For the first time in his life, Everett nodded instead of arguing. A month later, something unexpected happened. One of the oldest machinists collapsed at work. His name was Walter, 71 years old. He'd worked for Vance Works since he was 16. Rosalind visited him in the hospital after work. Walter smiled weakly. "I was afraid I'd lose my pension when everything changed." "You won't." "I know." He reached beneath his blanket and handed her a small wooden box. "My wife wanted you to have this." Inside lay dozens of tiny brass buttons, each one hand-polished. "My grandfather made these," Walter whispered. "We've been saving them for someone who still believed handmade things mattered." Rosalind held the tiny buttons in her palm. Somehow, they felt heavier than gold. That evening, she added the box to her father's sewing chest. Not because it belonged to him, because it belonged beside his dream. Christmas arrived, the first since Harold Vance's funeral. No one expected the family to gather, especially not after everything. Yet an invitation appeared in everyone's mailbox. Not printed, handwritten. Dinner. At the old house. No speeches. No lawyers. No business. Just family. Signed, Rosalind. She almost canceled 3 different times. But Nora wouldn't let her. "Families don't heal because they deserve another chance," Nora said. "They heal because somebody gives them one." Christmas evening felt awkward from the first minute. Everett arrived early. Delphine carried dessert. Theo ran straight toward Rosalind's workshop before anyone could stop him. "I finished another buttonhole." He proudly held up a crooked scrap of fabric. Rosalind inspected it with exaggerated seriousness. Theo held his breath. "The tension's better." His face exploded into a grin. Halfway through dinner, the conversation stalled. Silence settled over the table. The same silence that had haunted every holiday for 30 years. Then Everett quietly cleared his throat. "I owe everyone something." Nobody interrupted. He looked directly at Rosalind. "I don't know if I can apologize the right way." She waited. "I spent my whole life trying to become the son Dad wanted." His voice trembled. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be your brother." The room stayed perfectly still. "I can't change the gate. I can't change the funeral. I can't change what I called you." His eyes glistened. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to spend whatever years I've got left doing better." Rosalind looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table. Not dramatically, not for forgiveness, simply to refill his empty coffee cup. Then start tomorrow. That was all. No speeches. No tears. Just coffee. Sometimes healing sounds exactly like that. Months later, Gideon announced his retirement. The workers gathered in the factory courtyard. Before leaving, he handed Rosalind a small brass key. "What does it open?" she asked. "The very first office your father ever rented." "I didn't know we still owned it." "We don't." He smiled. "But the landlord heard what you've been doing. He said the key belongs to the family again." Rosalind visited the tiny building that afternoon. One room, one sewing machine, one cracked window. Nothing fancy. Just the place where Harold Vance had once begun with impossible hope. She stood quietly for several minutes, then smiled. She knew exactly what belonged there. A year later, the old office reopened. Not as another factory, not as a museum. As a free workshop, anyone willing to learn a trade could walk through the door. No tuition, no interviews, no family name required. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. "The Mender's House." Beneath it, smaller letters. "Every masterpiece begins with someone willing to fix what others throw away." On opening day, dozens of children crowded inside. Theo sat in the front row beside teenagers, retirees, veterans, single parents, and immigrants. No one asked where anyone came from. Only one question mattered. "What would you like to make?" Rosalind watched them from the doorway. Nora nudged her shoulder. "Your father would have been proud." Rosalind smiled gently. "I think—" She looked around the noisy room full of hopeful hands. "He finally is." Outside, sunlight warmed the old brick walls. Inside, needles clicked. Scissors whispered through cloth. Laughter drifted between work tables. And somewhere, hidden inside every careful stitch, a broken family quietly became whole. 5 years passed more quickly than Rosalind ever imagined. The factory was still standing. The old textile plant, once marked for closure, had become the heart of the company. Customers from around the world traveled just to watch master tailors work by hand. Apprentices filled every workshop, and the waiting list for admission to the Menders' house stretched nearly 2 years. What everyone admired most wasn't the clothing. It was the people. Workers stayed. Families stayed. Pride stayed. And that had become Vance Works' greatest luxury. One crisp autumn morning, Theo arrived at Rosalind's shop carrying a garment bag over his shoulder. He was 15 now, taller than she remembered, still awkward, still smiling with his whole face. "I need your opinion," he said nervously. Rosalind unzipped the bag. Inside hung a charcoal overcoat. Not perfect. The sleeves were slightly uneven. The collar rolled a little stiff. But every stitch had been sewn by Theo's own hands. She turned it inside out. He watched anxiously. She smiled before saying a word. "You patted the canvas. I remembered what you taught me. You even hand-felled the lining." Theo nodded proudly. "It took forever." Rosalind laughed. "The best things usually do." Theo hesitated before asking another question. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "I don't think I want to run the company." Rosalind blinked. "You don't?" He shook his head. "I like making things. I don't like meetings. I don't like numbers. I just—" He touched the sleeve of the coat. "I like this." Rosalind felt something tighten gently inside her chest. Years earlier, that sentence would have terrified the Vance family. Now, it sounded like freedom. "You know what your grandfather would say?" Theo smiled. "He'd probably tell me I'm wasting my life." Rosalind looked toward the workshop window where dozens of apprentices worked together. "No," she smiled softly. "I think he'd finally say, 'Good. Now make it well.'" That winter, Everett quietly knocked on Rosalind's office door. He looked older, grayer, calmer. "I've been thinking." She waited. "I want to step down from operations next year." She wasn't expecting that. "Why?" He smiled. "Because I'm finally good enough to know someone else can do it better." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Everett laughed. "Funny, isn't it? I spent 40 years chasing Dad's approval. And the day I stopped chasing, I finally became the man I wanted to be." Rosalind stood and hugged her brother. For the first time since childhood, he hugged her back. Months later, the company held its annual celebration. Unlike previous years, there was no grand ballroom, no expensive hotel, no luxury speeches. Instead, hundreds of employees gathered inside the old textile plant. Long wooden tables stretched across the floor. Families laughed together. Children ran between sewing machines decorated with flowers. Music echoed through the building. Nora stood to make a short speech. She hated speeches, which made everyone listen even more carefully. I've worked here 46 years. She looked around slowly. I've seen owners who knew every number and owners who knew every person's name. She smiled toward Rosalind. The second kind always leaves a better company behind. The applause lasted several minutes. Rosalind quietly wiped away a tear. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, she wandered through the silent factory. She switched off lights one by one. The familiar smell of wool and machine oil wrapped around her like an old friend. She eventually reached the boardroom. The same walnut table. The same windows. The same room where everything had changed. Only one thing remained on the table. Her father's sewing chest. She opened it. Inside rested the certificate. The faded swatch of charcoal herringbone. Walter's brass buttons. Harold's final letter. And something new. Theo's very first crooked buttonhole. She smiled. Every generation deserved a place inside the story. As she closed the lid, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Gideon, walking slower these days, using a cane he actually needed. You still keep everything? I do. He nodded approvingly. Good. After a quiet moment, he asked, Do you ever wish he'd simply told you? She knew exactly who he meant. Their father. Rosalind looked down at the sewing chest. For a long time, yes. And now? She gently rested her hand on the worn wood. Now I think people love with whatever tools they have. My father only knew how to sew. So he stitched his apology into my future. Gideon's eyes filled with tears. That's the finest thing I've ever heard. Several years later, newspapers announced the retirement of Rosalind Vance as chairwoman. Reporters expected a glamorous farewell. Instead, she gave only one sentence. A company is never remembered for the buildings it owns. It's remembered for the people who are proud they worked there. Then she walked away from the microphones, straight back to her little shop, 40 minutes south, exactly where she'd always belonged. Visitors still come to that shop today. Some arrive hoping to order a coat. Others simply want to meet the woman who changed, one of the oldest tailoring companies in the country. Most leave surprised, because they don't find a powerful executive. They find an older woman sitting beside a window, threading a needle, teaching nervous beginners, smiling every time someone ruins a seam, and every single time, she says the same words. Don't worry, everybody ruins the first 10. The important thing, I'm sitting back down. Above her workbench hangs only one framed sentence. Not a business award, not a magazine cover, not even her father's photograph. Just 7 simple words that changed an entire family forever. Every company needs someone who knows how to mend. People often ask whether Harold Vance truly loved his daughter. Rosalind always gives the same answer. He loved me imperfectly, but he trusted me completely. And in the end, that trust gave hundreds of families a future. She threads another needle, hands it to the next apprentice, and another story begins. 20 years later, most people driving past Vance Works never knew there had once been a war inside those walls. They saw a company famous for handcrafted tailoring, a business that had survived when dozens of larger competitors disappeared, a place where waiting 6 months for a jacket was considered normal because everyone knew one thing. Some things simply couldn't be rushed. Inside the entrance stood no bronze statue of Harold Vance, no portrait of Rosalind. Instead, visitors always stopped in front of a simple wooden display. Behind the glass rested an old sewing chest. Beside it hung a handwritten note. This company was built by people who believed every stitch mattered. If you work here, your hands matter too. Thousands of visitors read those words every year. Few realized they were the truest history of the company. Rosalind was 73 now. Her hair had turned silver. Her hands had become slower. The tiny scars from decades of needles were still there. She still worked 3 mornings every week in her little shop 40 minutes south. Not because she had to, because it reminded her who she was before the world finally noticed. One spring afternoon, a young woman knocked on her shop door. She looked nervous. "I was told you might help me." Rosalind smiled. "What happened?" "My family says tailoring isn't real work." Rosalind almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because life had a strange way of repeating itself. The young woman lowered her eyes. "They keep telling me I'll never be enough." Rosalind walked to the old sewing chest. She opened it slowly. Inside still rested her father's letter, the faded piece of herringbone cloth, Walter's brass buttons, Theo's first crooked buttonhole. She didn't show the girl the letter. Instead, she handed her a needle. "Sit." The young woman looked confused. "Shouldn't we talk first?" Rosalind smiled. "We are." Hours later, the girl's first seam wandered like a crooked country road. She sighed. "I'm terrible." Rosalind gently reached for the seam ripper. She carefully removed every stitch, then placed the fabric back in front of her. "Again." The girl frowned. "You aren't angry?" Rosalind shook her head. "I've learned something." "What's that?" "The world has enough judges. It doesn't have enough teachers." Across town, Theo, now a master tailor himself, was teaching another class of apprentices. Sometimes Everett quietly watched from the back of the room. His hair had gone white. He rarely spoke, but whenever a student became discouraged, he repeated the words he'd heard Rosalind say hundreds of times. "Sit back down." "You aren't finished yet." Nobody found it remarkable, except Everett. Because once upon a time, he'd believed people were valuable only when they won. Now he knew they became valuable every time they chose to keep learning. Gideon passed away peacefully that autumn. His funeral was small, simple, just as he would have wanted. When everyone had finished speaking, Rosalind stepped forward carrying one small package. Inside lay the old measuring tape Gideon had used for nearly 50 years. She placed it beside his hands, then whispered, "You measured people correctly." Nothing more needed saying. Years later, when Rosalind herself was gone, the shop remained exactly as she'd left it. The chair with worn stuffing, the smell of beeswax, the sharp old shears, the sewing chest. Every new apprentice who entered the workshop heard the same story. Not about an inheritance, not about a company, not even about a family. They heard about a woman who refused to let pain become cruelty. A daughter who discovered that real power wasn't the ability to destroy someone. It was the courage to repair what others believed was beyond saving. Theo eventually became chairman of Vance Works. On his first day, the board expected a long speech. Instead, he walked to the front carrying only one object. His first crooked buttonhole. He placed it in the center of the walnut table. Then said, "My great-grandfather built this company. My aunt saved it. My job is simply not to forget why." That was the entire speech. The board understood. Today, if you visit Vance Works, new apprentices are still taught one lesson before they ever touch expensive cloth. They are intentionally given cheap fabric and told to ruin it, again, and again, and again. Only after they've ruined enough seams are they allowed to make something beautiful. Above every workbench hangs the same sentence. The trade isn't the first 10 you ruin. It's whether you sit back down. No one remembers who first said it. Everyone lives by it. People sometimes ask what became of Harold Vance's greatest inheritance. They expect the answer to be the company, or the fortune, or the controlling shares. They are always wrong. His greatest inheritance was something much smaller. A daughter who finally believed her own hands were enough. Because once she believed it, hundreds of workers believed it. Then thousands of apprentices believed it. Then generations after them. One person's dignity became another person's future. That is how real legacies are stitched together. One careful hand, one honest choice, one act of mercy, one repaired seam at a time. Please like and subscribe. Heartwarming Tales.